I never thought my life, as quiet and hidden as it was, would ever collide with the gleaming world of the wealthy. My name is Evelyn, and I'm 31 years old. For the past 3 years, I've worked as a housekeeper in Richard Blake's mansion, a sprawling cold place filled with polished marble and silence heavy enough to crush a soul. Richard was a man of power and numbers, a famous businessman, but also divorced, cynical, and burdened by arrogance. I never imagined the storm that would come from one evening with him, the evening that changed everything. It began on an ordinary morning. I was polishing shelves in his office, moving quietly as always when he walked in, his jaw tight, his eyes sharp with impatience. He hardly looked at me when he spoke. "I need you to accompany me to an important dinner tonight. This is not an invitation, it's an instruction. Go and behave. I need someone discreet and without an opinion of their own." His words cut like ice, but I hid my surprise. To him, I wasn't a woman, not even a person. I was an object, something useful, silent, invisible. But something stirred inside me that day. Perhaps it was defiance, perhaps desperation, or simply the longing I had buried for years, the need to be seen. I accepted. I told myself I would follow his order, but deep down I felt a quiet current of determination. I would not be invisible that night. When I arrived at the restaurant dressed in a borrowed, elegant gown, Richard barely spared me a glance. "Let's go," he muttered curtly, as though I were nothing more than an accessory to his suit. As we stepped inside the glittering dining hall, I felt every pair of eyes turn to us. Wealth dripped from every corner: crystal chandeliers, fine wine, the hush of moneyed voices. At the center table sat his investors' men in expensive suits with calculating eyes, ready to dissect his every word. Richard introduced me carelessly, his tone dismissive. "This is Evelyn. She's accompanying me tonight. No last name, no respect, no recognition." I saw the investors' polite smiles thin into smirks. Some exchanged looks that burned with judgment. I felt their silent verdict: I didn't belong here. I could have shrunk back into silence, but I didn't. As the dinner unfolded, their talk was all about profits, expansions, numbers that blurred together like endless chains. I sat quietly at first, absorbing every detail. Then one investor, Mr. Lewis, a tall man with sharp eyes and a condescending smile, turned to me. "So, Evelyn, how do you feel about attending a business dinner like this?" His tone dripped with mockery, as if he expected me to stammer or blush. My heart raced. I could have smiled and deflected, but something within me refused to bow. I met his gaze and spoke calmly. "Actually, it's fascinating to see how everything works up close. The financial details are important, yes, but I believe understanding the people behind the numbers is just as essential." The table froze. Forks paused mid-air, conversation stilled. Richard's face hardened, his jaw clenching in irritation. But Mr. Lewis leaned back, surprised and intrigued. "An interesting perspective," he murmured, his eyes gleaming with curiosity. Suddenly the attention shifted to me, the woman who was supposed to remain invisible. Richard hated it. I could feel his fury in every glance he refused to give me, but I couldn't stop. When the conversation turned toward social responsibility, I seized the moment. "I believe companies exist for more than profit," I said steadily. "They should give back to the communities that support them. That's real success." The silence was suffocating. Every gaze weighed on me, but I didn't falter. Mr. Lewis smiled approvingly, and even some of the other investors looked at me with new respect. Richard, however, looked like he was being slowly strangled by his own pride. He had brought me here to be silent, and instead I had become the voice that unsettled his carefully built world. After the dinner, Richard walked ahead, leaving me behind as though I were nothing. I followed quietly, but inside, I burned with both triumph and dread. For the first time, I had felt the power of my own voice. And yet I knew men like Richard would never forgive a servant for daring to stand tall. Back at the mansion, he wasted no time. His voice was sharp, his eyes cold with disdain. "What were you thinking, Evelyn? I asked you to be discreet, not the center of attention." I stood, my hands trembling but my voice steady. "I only answered a question, Mr. Blake. I did nothing wrong." "You're a housekeeper," he snapped. "You're not paid to have an opinion." His words fell like a slap, but I held his gaze. And in that moment, I knew I would never again let him or anyone strip me of my dignity. That night, he fired me. His arrogance thought it was punishment, but for me, it was liberation. I walked out of that mansion with nothing but my pride intact, and unknowingly I walked toward the storm that would shatter his empire and awaken my destiny. I left the mansion that night with my heart pounding in my ears. The cold air bit my skin, but inside me, there was a strange warmth, a fire I hadn't felt in years. I had lost my job, yes, but I had gained something far more important, the certainty that my voice mattered. For too long I had been silent, caged by poverty, by grief, by the constant reminder that women like me weren't allowed to dream. But that night at the business dinner, with all those powerful men listening, I realized that I had something they couldn't ignore: truth, spoken without fear. Still, reality was merciless. I had bills to pay, rent due, and Oliver, my younger brother who depended on me, was still in college, relying on every dollar I sent. Losing this job meant more than just my pride. It meant our survival. For days I searched for work, taking whatever temporary cleaning shifts I could find. Each time I passed the mansion on the hill, my stomach turned. I told myself I hated it, hated him, hated the way he made me feel small, and then furious for daring to rise. But fate is cruelly persistent. A week later, I was called into a law office by a friend who worked there as a secretary. She had heard whispers Richard Blake's empire was not as solid as he liked to pretend. His investors were doubting him after the dinner, shocked that a housekeeper could raise points he hadn't. His pride had taken a blow, and cracks were beginning to form. My friend leaned close, her voice low. "You don't know what you did that night. They listened to you more than to him. And now, they're questioning him." I wanted to laugh or maybe cry. Had my one act of defiance planted doubt deep enough to shake his throne? The thought thrilled and terrified me. For the first time, I wondered if my story with Richard wasn't over, if the fire I felt inside me was pushing me back into the storm, not away from it. The storm came faster than I expected. One evening, I returned to my small apartment to find Richard himself standing at my door, immaculate as ever, but his face was pale, his eyes hollow. "Evelyn," he said, his voice tight, "we need to talk." I almost slammed the door in his face. Why to remind me I'm just a housekeeper, or to fire me twice? His jaw clenched. "I shouldn't have said that. I was angry. You embarrassed me." "I spoke the truth," I replied coldly. "Yes," he admitted, his voice low. "And that's the problem. They listened to you." Silence hung between us, heavy and tense. Finally he continued, "I need your help." I stared at him, disbelief coursing through me. "My help?" "After the way you treated me." He nodded slowly. "The investors want to meet again. They want you there. They said you brought perspective. Without you, I may lose everything." For a moment, I felt satisfaction, justice, perhaps watching him bend where he once towered. But I also saw the man beneath the suit, desperate, cornered, vulnerable. And though my pride screamed at me to shut the door, something deeper, something I didn't yet understand, kept me listening. "I won't be invisible again," I said finally. "If I do this, it's on my terms." His eyes flickered with something I couldn't name. Agreed. The second dinner was nothing like the first. This time I didn't sit silently at the edge of the table. I spoke. I challenged. I reminded them of the importance of trust, of responsibility, of integrity. Richard watched me with a mix of awe and unease, as though he didn't know whether I was saving him or stealing the ground from under his feet. Perhaps I was doing both. That night the investors shook my hand before they shook his, and I knew with a clarity that stole my breath that everything had changed. But I also knew power is never given freely. Men like Richard don't share their thrones, they guard them. And as much as he needed me now, one day he would see me as a threat. The war between us hadn't ended. It had only just begun. After that second dinner, my life began to shift in ways I hadn't imagined possible. For the first time, people with power looked at me and actually saw me. Not as the housekeeper in the background, but as a voice that mattered. I could feel it in the way the investors leaned closer when I spoke, in the way they nodded at my points, even when Richard tried to redirect the conversation back to numbers and profits. For them, I was fresh air in a suffocating room of rehearsed speeches and rehearsed smiles. But for Richard, I was becoming a mirror he could not bear to look into. He watched me like a man who had built his empire on stone and suddenly saw hairline cracks appear. At first, his eyes carried disbelief, then irritation, and finally, something closer to fear. I knew it, and he knew I knew it. That awareness hung between us like a charged wire. Yet he couldn't push me aside, not this time. His empire was too fragile, his reputation too bruised after my unexpected defiance. The investors wanted me there, and their will was stronger than his pride. So he tolerated me walking beside me at meetings, introducing me now with a forced politeness that almost sounded like respect. But behind closed doors, his tone shifted. "You're playing a dangerous game, Evelyn," he warned one night after we returned from another dinner. "These men don't see you as an equal. They see you as a novelty. And when they tire of you, they'll discard you just like they discard everyone else." I stood my ground, meeting his piercing gaze. "Then let them tire of me. At least I won't live invisible. At least I won't choke on silence like you do every day." His face hardened, but something flickered in his eyes, a glint of pain quickly buried. It was the first time I wondered if his arrogance was only armor hiding scars I hadn't yet uncovered. In the weeks that followed, the power dynamic shifted further. Investors began calling me directly, seeking my perspective. Newspapers mentioned me in passing, labeling me the unexpected voice at Blake's table. Richard grew colder, more restless. I could sense the storm building even as I tasted small victories. And then came the night everything cracked wide open. We were at yet another dinner, this one more intimate, with only a few of his closest allies present. Wine flowed freely. Laughter echoed, but beneath it all was a tension I couldn't ignore. Halfway through the evening, one of the investors, an older man with sharp eyes, leaned toward me and said, "Evelyn, you speak so eloquently about responsibility. Tell me, what do you really think of Blake's empire? Do you believe it stands on integrity?" The table went silent. Richard's jaw tightened, his hand gripping the stem of his glass so hard I thought it might shatter. My heart pounded in my chest. This was a trap or perhaps a test. Either way, the room demanded an answer. I could have smiled, politely evaded the question, preserved his pride. But that wasn't who I was anymore. I took a breath, steadying my voice. An empire built only on profit will eventually collapse. Without integrity, wealth is just a house of cards waiting for the right wind. Gasps, murmurs, the shifting of chairs. Richard's eyes burned into me, fury barely contained. Yet even in his anger, I saw something else, something like recognition. He knew I was right. He had always known. The rest of the dinner passed in strained silence. When it ended, Richard barely spoke as we drove back. But the moment we were alone in the mansion, he turned on me. "You humiliated me." His voice was raw, stripped of its usual cold control. "In front of men I've known for decades, you undermined me." I faced him, my voice trembling but strong. "I didn't humiliate you, Richard. I told the truth. And the fact that the truth humiliates you, that's not my burden to carry." His chest rose and fell with ragged breaths. For a moment I thought he would fire me again, or worse. But instead he turned away, his shoulders collapsing under a weight I couldn't see. That night alone in my small apartment, I realized the battlefield had changed. This was no longer about a housekeeper defying her employer. This was about something far deeper: power, legacy, redemption, and the secrets Richard Blake was fighting to keep buried. I didn't know yet what those secrets were, but I knew they were coming for both of us. The days that followed were heavy with silence. Richard avoided me as much as he could, speaking only when necessary, his tone clipped and mechanical. But I noticed things: small trembling cracks in the armor he wore so tightly, sleepless shadows beneath his eyes, a whiskey glass left unfinished on his desk, files locked away in drawers that he checked and rechecked as though guarding them from ghosts. One evening, as I was leaving a late meeting, one of the investors, Mr. Lewis, the same man who once mocked me, caught up with me outside the restaurant. He lit a cigar, his eyes narrowing through the smoke. "You know, Evelyn," he said, "you're braver than most. But bravery can be dangerous. Be careful digging too deep into Blake's affairs. Some secrets are not meant to be uncovered." My stomach tightened. What secrets? He gave a humorless smile, the kind that ruined families. And then he walked away, leaving the bitter smoke and a chill crawling down my spine. That night, I couldn't sleep. His words rattled in my skull until I finally gave in to the impulse that had been gnawing at me for weeks. I returned to the mansion after hours, using the spare key I still had from my days as his housekeeper. The house was dark, echoing with loneliness. I moved silently through the halls, the marble floors cold under my shoes until I reached his office. The drawers he guarded were locked, but desperation gives strength. I forced them open, my hands shaking as I sifted through folder after folder, financial documents, contracts, and then letters, old yellowed at the edges, written in a hand I somehow recognized, though I hadn't seen it in years. My breath caught. They were from my mother. I sank into the chair, my eyes racing over every word. My mother, who had died when I was 19, had written to Richard's father pleading for help, pleading for fairness after my father was accused of fraud and driven to despair. She wrote of how the Blake family had destroyed ours with fabricated charges, leaving us penniless and broken. And there, at the bottom of one letter, was a note in Richard's father's handwriting: "Keep them quiet. Bury it." My hands trembled so violently the paper nearly tore. All these years I thought my father's downfall had been his fault, that he had been weak, dishonest. I carried the shame like a scar across my soul, but here it was the truth. We weren't destroyed by weakness. We were destroyed by the Blakes, by his family. Suddenly the pieces fit. The way Richard flinched when I spoke about integrity, the way he avoided my eyes whenever responsibility was mentioned. He knew. Maybe not all the details, but enough to live in the shadow of his family's sins. When I confronted him the next morning, my rage was a storm. I slammed the letters onto his desk. "Did you know about this?" My voice broke, but I didn't care. "Did you know what your family did to mine?" He froze. For the first time since I had known him, Richard Blake looked small, like a boy cornered, stripped of his shields. His lips parted, but no words came. "You knew," I whispered, the betrayal burning through me like acid. "All this time you knew why my family suffered, why I had to scrub floors and clean toilets just to survive. And you let me stand in your house invisible while you lived off the ruins of my father's name." His eyes glistened, not with pride, not with anger, but with something dangerously close to shame. "Evelyn," he said hoarsely, I didn't know it was your family. I only found out when you started speaking at those dinners. I recognized the name in the old files. I wanted to tell you, but what I cut in, you thought silence would protect you. You thought lies could protect me. My father died with that shame, Richard. My mother begged your family for mercy, and they buried her words. And you..." My voice broke entirely. "You're the son of the man who destroyed mine." The room felt like it was collapsing. He reached for me, but I stepped back. I couldn't bear the touch of the man who carried the bloodline that had cursed us. That day, I walked out of the mansion for the last time. Not as his housekeeper, not as his reluctant ally, but as a woman carrying the full weight of betrayal. Yet beneath the anguish, another fire sparked to life. I wouldn't just survive this revelation. I would use it. I would expose every lie, every crime, every secret the Blakes had buried. If his family had destroyed mine, then mine would be the hand that ended his empire. I didn't cry that night. Not a single tear. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with the letters spread out in front of me like evidence in a trial that hadn't yet begun. My father's name written in trembling ink, my mother's pleas ignored and discarded, and the cruel scrawl of Richard's father sealing our fate with a command to bury it. The shame that had haunted me my whole life suddenly shifted into rage. For years I had believed my father was weak, that his failure had left us destitute. I had carried that wound in silence, hiding it from Oliver, from everyone. But now I knew the truth: we weren't victims of bad luck or incompetence. We were victims of betrayal, deliberate, calculated, and merciless. I wanted the world to know. I wanted Richard Blake to feel the weight of his family's sins press against him until he broke. But revenge is not simple. It requires patience, planning, and sacrifice. And in that moment, I realized I was ready to give all three. The first step was finding allies. My friend at the law office introduced me to a journalist she trusted, a woman named Claire, who had made a career exposing corporate corruption. When I laid the letters on her desk, her eyes widened. She touched the brittle paper as if it were gold. "Do you know what you have here?" she whispered. "This could bring down the Blakes. Not just Richard, the entire empire. Higher." Her words lit a fire in me, but they also scared me. Bringing down a family like the Blakes meant painting a target on my back. Richard had already shown flashes of shame, but shame doesn't stop powerful men from protecting what's theirs. And I wasn't sure yet which side of history he would choose, mine or his blood's. Still, I pressed forward. We began building the case, gathering other victims who had been silenced by Blake Enterprises. Old partners, ruined families, bankrupt small businesses, one by one their stories surfaced, each a variation of my own. A pattern of destruction hidden under marble floors and expensive suits. Meanwhile, Richard kept trying to contact me. Calls, letters slipped under my door, messages through mutual acquaintances. Some were angry, some desperate, some almost tender. But I ignored them all. Until one night I opened my door to find him standing there in the rain, his suit soaked, his eyes hollow. "Evelyn," he said, his voice raw. "I can't undo what my father did, but I can help you. Let me help you." I wanted to slam the door in his face. My heart screamed at me to do it, but something in his eyes stopped me, the same flicker of pain I had seen weeks before, the same hint of a man at war with himself. I stepped aside, wordless, and let him in. We sat at my table, the very one where I had spread my mother's letters, and for the first time Richard spoke without arrogance. He told me about growing up under his father's iron hand, about watching him ruin lives without flinching, about learning to hide his conscience behind walls of wealth. "I tried to be different," he said, his voice breaking, "but I never knew how. And then you walked into that dinner, and for the first time I saw what honesty looks like. I hated you for it, but I couldn't stop listening." Tears pricked my eyes, but I forced them back. "Words won't bring my father back. Words won't erase what your family did." "I know," he whispered. "That's why I'll give you everything you need. The files, the evidence, the names. I'll testify if I have to. Just don't shut me out. Not because of his sins." I stared at him, torn between fury and something dangerously close to hope. Could I trust him? Or was this another Blake tactic appearing broken so I'd lower my guard? In the end, I chose neither trust nor rejection. I chose strategy. "If you mean what you say," I told him, "then prove it. Help me burn down what your father built. Not for me. For every family he destroyed." Richard nodded slowly, rainwater dripping from his hair. "Then we fight together." And so we did. For months, we worked in secret, me, Richard, Claire, the journalist, and a growing circle of voices once silenced by fear. Piece by piece, we assembled the puzzle of corruption, forging a weapon of truth sharp enough to pierce even the Blake name. But I knew this war wouldn't end cleanly. I knew there would be sacrifices, betrayals, and maybe even heartbreak. Because revenge isn't a straight path, it's a maze. And every turn was leading me closer to a final revelation I wasn't sure I was ready to face. The storm broke the night our story hit the papers. Claire's article wasn't just an expose, it was a detonation, the Blake legacy built on lies. The headline screamed across every front page, accompanied by scans of my mother's letters and testimonies from other victims. Overnight, the empire that had seemed untouchable trembled. Investors pulled out, lawsuits multiplied, protesters gathered outside Blake Enterprises with signs that echoed my own anger: justice for the forgotten. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I felt the weight of a world crashing down around me. My phone buzzed, non-stop calls from reporters, threats from anonymous numbers, even pleading messages from former employees who feared losing their jobs. Oliver begged me to be careful, his young voice tight with worry. And through it all, Richard hovered like a shadow, torn between loyalty to me and the ruin of everything he'd been raised to protect. The board turned on him within days. He was ousted, humiliated in the very offices where he'd once ruled. I watched from the back of the courtroom as he stood, shoulders heavy, while lawyers dissected his father's sins. Some tried to drag his name into the mud with the rest, but he surprised me. He didn't fight it. He admitted the truth, acknowledged the victims, and surrendered the illusion of innocence. Watching him, I couldn't tell if I was seeing a man fall or finally stand tall for the first time. Yet with every victory came a new wound. One night, as I was leaving a meeting with Claire, I felt eyes on me. A black car idled at the corner, its windows tinted, engine running. It was gone before I could get close, but the message was clear: someone wanted me afraid. And when I returned home, I found my apartment door ajar, the lock broken. Inside, nothing was stolen, but my mother's letters were gone. Panic ripped through me. Those letters were my anchor, my father's redemption, my mother's voice preserved in ink. Without them, the case was weaker. Without them, I was weaker. I called Richard in a fury, my voice shaking. "Your family is still trying to silence me." He arrived within minutes, his face pale with anger. "I'll find them," he promised. "I swear to you, Evelyn, I won't let them erase this." But the damage was already done. For the first time since this war began, doubt crept in. Could I really win against a family with roots so deep, with power so ruthless? Or was I fooling myself, dragging everyone I loved into danger for a battle that could never truly be won? The answer came weeks later at a final court hearing. The prosecution had built a mountain of evidence, but without the letters it felt incomplete. Then, just as the judge was about to dismiss a crucial charge, Richard stood. His voice shook, but his words carried a weight that silenced the room. "My father buried those letters," he said, "but I read them. I know what he did, and I have copies." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "I made them the night Evelyn found them because I knew someday the truth would have to survive, even if I didn't." The courtroom erupted. My heart stopped. He had saved them. All this time, even as I doubted him, he had kept the truth safe. When the judge banged the gavel and declared that the Blakes would face full trial for fraud, corruption, and conspiracy, I felt a weight lift from my chest. My father's name was cleared. My mother's pleas were heard. The silence that had smothered me for years cracked apart, replaced by something fierce and freeing. Afterward, outside the courthouse, Richard found me in the crowd. He looked smaller now, stripped of his empire, his wealth, his arrogance, but in his eyes was something raw, something human. "I can't undo the past," he whispered, "but if you'll let me, I want to help you build a future." I stared at him, torn between the fury that still burned and the strange, undeniable bond that had grown in the fire of this war. Could I forgive the son of the man who destroyed my family? Could love rise from ashes this black? I didn't answer that day. Some questions need more than words. Some need time and healing and the slow rebuilding of trust. But as I walked away, I knew this much revenge had given me justice, but it was truth that gave me peace. And whatever came next, whether love or solitude or something in between, I would never again be invisible. I would never again let silence bury me. If my story has touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Leave a comment below if you've ever fought for the truth against impossible odds. I read them all, and your voices mean more than you know.